During the slow time after the Penacony quest, I replayed through the 1.x Lofu quest. Since the dev teaser returned to the Shanzou, I thought this might be a good idea to try to understand what the heck actually happened there. Maybe it was just my reading comprehension, maybe it was the writing, but I was so confused on my first playthrough. Why did Himiko look so annoyed when Kafka's hologram showed up on the Express? Who are the 3 people that must pay the price? Why is Danheng one of them? Why is Jingyuan not one of them? What crime did Danheng commit? Is he Danfeng? Why are they cautious of Jingliu? What's a Sanctus Medicus? What is that gigantic tree? Heliobai? Plague's Author? Ruin Author? Rainbow Arbiter? Tingyun is dead? There were many subplots going on, many unfamiliar terms explained in bloated sentences that got me lost in translation. Only after getting myself familiarized with these terms, weeding out all the subplots in my second playthrough, that I realized how simple the premise of the story was. A follower of Nanook, the Destruction, wanted to see the Shanzou destroyed from within. That's it, as simple as that. So, if you were like me during your playthrough, confused, lost in translation, then this video is for you because now I'm going to retell it to you. The story of the Shanzou Lofu simplified. The Express crew had just departed from Yarilo 6, huddling to announce their next destination. This meeting was quickly interrupted by Kafka's hologram that suggested that they should go to Shanzou Lofu instead. A stellar burst had just occurred on the planet and the crew were nearby. Surely the noble and righteous Trailblazer would hate to see a planet destroyed by a Stellaron, right? Also, it was not the hunter's doing, but her companion Blade had been captured and blamed for it. After a little back and forth, the vote was in favor of the Lofu. This time, Trailblazer and March got off the train along with Welt instead of Danheng because he just so happened to have been banished and was not allowed entry to the Lofu. Like, of all the planets in the universe, they just had to go to the one where Danheng was exiled from. As for why he was banished, it is a bit complex and soon you will see that it doesn't even matter to the plot, so don't worry about it for now. Now, while they call it a planet, the Shanzou Lofu is in fact a ship. It is one of the 6 ships of the Shanzou Alliance, so if you wanna call it the Lofu, omitting Shanzou from the name, it is still correct. The Shanzou Alliance itself is a faction that follows Lan the Hunt. Shanzou literally means immortal ship. It is an alliance of ships inhabited by long-life species that have been blessed with immortality by Yaoshe the Abundance. This blessing was something that the Shanzou native intentionally sought out in ancient times and eventually found. Yaoshe blessed them with a tree that bore fruits of immortality. But of course, things that are too good to be true are sometimes not true. Their lifespan became unlimited while their resources remain limited, diminishing over time, a recipe for disaster. Then at some point in their unlimited lifespan, their mental state started crumbling, their bodies growing and mutating until they lost their human form, turning them into monsters, a condition known as Mara Struck. Yoshi's blessing turned out to be a curse in disguise, thus earning the Aeon the title of the Plague's Author. The trio came across these Mara-struck people upon their arrival. They also came across Tingyun, a Foxian who worked for the trader department of the Shanzou. She brought the crew to see her leader, Madame Yukong, because she was not buying Welt's explanation on how the crew managed to get to the Lofu. The planet had been under lockdown since the stellar burst occurred, and Tingyun's ship was the last one allowed entry, so how could the Astral Express arrive after hers? Who let them in? Yukong shared this sentiment because she found traces of Silverwolf hacking into their system and opening the gate for the Astral Express, implying that the crew were in cahoots with the Stellaron hunters. Jingyuan, the general of the Lofu, effectively Yukong's superior, jumped in and asked the crew to locate Kafka instead. He was aware of Kafka's comms to the Express, and while it did not necessarily mean that the Express crew and the Stellar hunters were working together, it did not prove the opposite either. The only way for the crew to prove their innocence was by locating and capturing Kafka. Their offer to locate the Stellar rejected, their movement on the Lofu restricted, the crew were left with no option but to accept Jingyuan's terms. Accompanied by Tingyun, they started looking for Kafka. Around the same time, Danheng decided to go after the trio once he learned that Blade was also on the Lofu. Blade was dangerous, so being at the same place as him would put the crew in danger. By this point, you might notice that the crew's movements were pretty much controlled by the Stellaron hunters. Kafka's request changed their destination from Penacony to the Lofu. Their entry to the planet was enabled by Silverwolf, leading to the initial distrust of Yukong and Jingyuan, and the only way to prove their innocence was by capturing Kafka. Danheng, who was exiled from the Lofu and had chosen to stay back, hastily got off the train once he learned that Blade was there. Their every move was in fact scripted by Elio, the leader of the Stellaron Hunters, because it was his goal to get the crew on the Luofu precisely for this crisis. That way, the crew could help to locate and seal the Stellaron. The Shanzou would know of the Trailblazers, see them as one of the good guys, and fill in debt for their help during the crisis. Elio orchestrated the crew's becoming the heroes of the Luofu. This was something that Kafka shared with Trailblazer after she was captured, or rather, after she let herself be captured. I mean, she had no problem freeing herself from the shackles afterwards, and while everyone was distracted by the resurrection of the Ambrosial Arbor, she escaped the scene. This Ambrosial Arbor was the tree that Yaoshi gave to the Shanzou. It had remained dormant for centuries after Lan severed it with their arrow and had stopped bearing fruits that might attract people who seek immortality, but now had regained vitality thanks to the Stellaron. The Stellaron was planted on the arbor to promote its growth by a group of Yaoshi's followers that called themselves the Disciples of Sanctus Medicus. Sanctus Medicus in Latin means holy and physician respectively, is the title given to Yaoshi by this group. Their goal was to bring the Shanzou back on the path of abundance, believing that Mara was not a curse but rather a blessed evolution, and that the hunt was stopping them from transcending. The crew managed to corner the leader of this fanatic group, and just before she was captured, she exposed Tingyun. The Foxian, who had been nothing but a faithful and helpful tour guide for the crew, turned out to be none other than Phantilia, an emanator of destruction. And if your first reaction to this revelation was, "What?" you were correct for reacting that way. Bonus point if you were confused as to where this emanator came from and why it felt so out of the blue. I mean, Tingyun did seem overly interested in immortality, fascinated by the resurrected Ambrosial Arbor, but how are we supposed to know that that was not simply how Tingyun had always been? Maybe she really was just that into immortality, you know? But in fact, the Tingyun that the crew met had always been Phantilia in disguise. She conjured up an illusion in the image of Tingyun to get into the Luofu. She stayed close to the crew to get closer to the roots of the Ambrosial Arbor. Once her true identity was exposed, she destroyed her Tingyun disguise and revealed her true form, which was some kind of a flame spirit called Heliobi. Summoning her Antimatter Legion soldiers to stall the crew, she went to the roots of the Ambrosial Arbor. By this point, Danheng had almost caught up with the crew. He had been traveling with Sushang, a Cloud Knight soldier, and Losha, a traveling merchant who carried a coffin with him. Knowing that the crew was nearby, Danheng sneakily left his companions and proceeded on his own. And I think it is time to talk about Danheng's banishment from the Luofu. I'll try to make it quick and not as convoluted. The Danheng that we've seen so far is simply not his true form. He was in fact a Vidyadhara, another long-lived species that inhabited the Shanzou. If you have lost your 50-50 to Bailu, then you should be familiar with this race. Danheng's true form specifically is that of the High Elder of the Vidyadhara, the leader of that race on the Luofu titled Imbiber Lunae. Remember when they were about to be captured by the Silvermane guards in Belobog and Mars suggested Danheng to unleash his secret power? As it turns out, he did have a secret power, and he was exiled from the Luofu for a crime that was committed by his past life, Danfeng. After undergoing a molting rebirth, a reincarnation process that is unique to the Vidyadhara as a form of punishment for his crime, Danfeng reincarnated into Danheng. He was held in prison for a time before eventually exiled. That was why Danheng said he could not set foot on the Luofu, except he did anyway, and it came with no greater cost than him earning the name Silent but Deadly from Sushang. His exile from the Luofu left the Ambrosial Arbor unguarded, as it was the duty of the High Elder to keep watch over it. The crime that Danfeng committed also resulted in Blade's immortality, which made Blade resent him and his incarnation. With little to no memory of his past life, Danheng thought that Blade was simply a dangerous and bloodthirsty man. So you see, this is why Blade was on the Luofu and why Kafka brought him up in her comms to the Express. It was not enough to make the crew change their destination, because Elio knew that Danheng would not set foot on the planet. Yet it was crucial for Danheng to be there because Phantilia was planning to take control of the arbor, and the only one who could undo the seal to get to the roots of the arbor was Danheng. So Elio sent Blade as bait, a motivation for Danheng to overlook the decree of his banishment and get to his crew to ensure their safety. And of course, Blade would be there to intercept Danheng's effort and force him to reveal his true form. A pretty straightforward plan from Elio, the storytelling of it was not. Now that we have all the actors in place, Danheng undid the seal on the roots of the arbor, and together with Jingyuan, the crew rushed to stop Phantilia. Phantilia showed off the body she fashioned out of the arbor, toyed with the crew, and at one point captured Jingyuan, attempting to turn him into one of her anti-Matter Legion soldiers. This created a connection between her and Jingyuan, an opening for Dan Heng to pierce Jingyuan with his spear, effectively severing the connection and destroying Phantilia's vessel. And I think it's worth mentioning that Phantilia was not defeated. Dan Heng and Jingyuan only destroyed a stolen body, something that Phantilia mocked Jingyuan for afterwards, while she had successfully planted the seed of destruction on the Luofu. In the aftermath of it, the Luofu held a Foxian-style funeral to honor those who died during the crisis, among which was Ting Yun, or so the official declared. Then Jingyuan awarded the crew with a jade abacus that they could use anytime, only once though, if they ever needed help from the Alliance. So now the crew has the Alliance on speed dial, basically. The crew said goodbye to everyone on the Luofu and left the planet. A final cutscene showed Luocha surrendering himself for bringing the Stellaron into the Luofu, along with Jing Liu, who said that they would put the abundance in their grave, a loose thread that was never talked about again until the aftermath of 2.5 Quest. The end. Well, I believe that took a bit longer than 8 minutes. In any case, I hope this refreshes your memory of the Luofu quest and sheds some light on the confusion the plot causes you. Let me know if you want to see other quests summarized like this one, otherwise this will be a one-off trial video and we'll move on from it. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.